everyone. Good morning. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Awesome. Who had the best dinner last night? Okay, that's so cool. Awesome. Well, we are going to get started. We have a phenomenal conversation about to come up. Good morning, Julie, Reggie, Layla, and Daniel. Say good morning to all your friends.
Good morning, friends.
Hi. Well, we are going to kick off. We've had some great, dive in from design sessions, looking up at the sky, big picture, and, really dive in on future-proofing for intergenerational family, economic mobility, prosperity, and well-being. And we have 4 outstanding future-proof leaders here on the stage, or not, in terms of future-proofing.
Here we go.
Playing with y'all. Daniel's like, what's going on? I'm totally teasing. But we have Julie Sweetland, who is coming to here from Frameworks. Many of you have known of her and her team's incredible work around narrative, storytelling, strategic communications. Julie and her team have been longtime partners with Ascend in this community, but so many. And so, Julie, thanks for making the time to be out here with us, as always. Reggie Bika, Ascend Fellow, inaugural class, current president and CEO of the American Public Human Services Association. We know Reggie. Of course, we've got Layla Zidane, who is a member of the Catalyst Collective, an Ascend Fellow as well. No CC love? They're quiet this morning.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But she flew in last night from a board meeting, but where she is leading Future Caucus, which she'll share more about, which I think is one of the more exciting things we're seeing in the political leadership arena. And then, of course, we have Daniel Williams, another Ascend Fellow from... all right.
Fellowship of the Ring.
And also the president and CEO of the Steelcase Foundation in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so, I was sort of playing around with future proofing, and so forgive me for that. But part of it is because it's sort of a new term that's come out that, by one definition, it's sort of anticipating the future and developing the methods of minimizing the effects of shocks and stresses of events to come. And so, that's one term. There's a few other folks that have their terms. But I play with that because...
We all had to look it up in.
That was good. And
Yeah.
so, but it's one of these things where a lot of times I feel like in the world, people are looking for the new thing or the new fad. So that's why I was being a little bit playful this morning, because I think a lot of why Ascend got created, a lot of the work you all are doing goes to that fundamental question of what does it mean to cultivate a new future that has yet to be seen, experienced, or lived. And so, I think some of this conversation for me, there's future proofing, there's future building and creating, which you all have been doing all along. And then there was this part where there was an interesting article around future making from an Australian business professor, Daniel Logue, who I kind of like this little term, so playing with things. Possibilistic thinking. Possibilistic thinking. And that's the cognitive practice that involves the systematic deconstruction and interrogation of the assumptions upon which solutions are based and develop new worlds. So if we go back to our kickoff night and we think about brilliant Micah, are you here this morning? All righty. But she said very simply in the beginning, remember to be aware of how society has taught us to answer questions, how we can have our own biases hold us back from curiosity and questions. And so I just sort of use that to lay the stage again. And so playing with we're just going to kind of bring in this conversation together where each of these phenomenal experts come from different places and perches in the world. But we all kind of share the vision about what would it like if all families were thriving and living the lives they dream of and they deserve. What could that really look like? And so, Julie, kicking off with you, how do you think about what is future-proofing, sort of, how do you define it, and how does that show up in how you think about your work?
It's such an interesting question. Thank you for having me and frameworks here. Because I hadn't heard the term before, but it instantly made sense because so much of what we're doing with framing is painting that picture of the future that we want. And recognizing that the stories we tell today are dress rehearsals for the policies and programs society will endorse tomorrow. And so I guess we're doing future proofing all the time as we're working with coalitions and networks and movements like yours to think about painting a positive vision of what tomorrow can look like. One of the things we're finding in our research coming out of the cultural shocks of 2020 and 2021 is that Americans, more than ever before, are having a real hard time imagining a positive future on anything, on any issue. And that itself is a real risk to any of the initiatives and any of the type of work that we're doing, hoping for a real strong set of systems and structures to support children and families. So any of the aspirational work that your aspirational meaning making you all are doing is some of the way we support groups in future proofing.
Thank you. Reggie, how about you?
Thanks, Ann. You know, when I was thinking about future-proofing after looking up the definition and understanding the question, what came to me was that future-proofing requires a balance of maintaining an unyielding commitment to your purpose with an intentional adaptability to be responsive to surrounding influences and disruptions. And I began to reflect on Martin Luther King Jr. and in the civil rights movement. And his vision about what America could be if we all were equal. And using language to articulate that and to paint that vision. And to call out those people respectfully but directly who opposed the direction that he was headed. And at the same time recognizing that the path to civil rights is not a linear one. It's one where we have to be adaptive. It's one where we have to take advantage of opportunities that come up that we didn't anticipate, that we may have to take a step back at times in order to take 2 or 3 steps forward. That there might be a crisis that if we take advantage of that critical situation, we could move something forward. And so that's really what's at with me over the last couple of weeks as I've been thinking about this and using that example of the importance of knowing where you want to be, sending that message, but also being flexible on the pathway to get there.
That's really powerful. Thank you.
So I think about it, a little differently. And this morning at my table, somebody had asked about the architecture of this place, about the Aspen campus. And it made me think about this weekend I was in Chicago. Is anyone here from Chicago or been to Chicago? Wow, okay. So I was there to watch my husband run the marathon, and we had like a moment of fun, took the river tour, the architecture boat tour, and the guide told us about these amazing buildings that had been built recently or had been built a long time ago, and they all had something interesting about them, whether they were sustainable and used sort of water for cooling, or had been renovated from warehouses and now are residential, or one of the buildings we saw is like the tallest building in the world that a female architect has made, and there's these like blow-through floors where the wind can just pass through so that there's stability in the frame, and that sort of makes it stable in the face of unpredictable futures. And so I just was thinking this morning about this notion of architects as future proofers, and I think that's a lot of what we do at Future Caucus, is like the political and government version of architects who future-proof. And so as you sort of alluded to, what we do is we work with young elected leaders in Congress, in state legislatures, to help them build relationships across the aisle and work on policy solutions so that political polarization is not an obstacle to solving big problems. And we're in 34 states. Each chapter is led by a young Democrat, a young Republican. And what they do is build trust so that when something comes up, when some crisis arises, some opportunity presents itself for the legislature to take action on, they are able to design a solution that incorporates a lot of different perspectives and that can be durable and that can stand the test of time. And that can actually happen in a pretty polarized environment. And so as I think about this question about what is future-proofing and how do we think about it in this moment, I really do think about what I hope out of our democracy, out of the way that we can think about democracy as a future-proofer. What are the processes, what are the institutions that enable that? Who are the leaders who are in those institutions that are stewarding that way of thinking and being? And how can we support them in actually advancing solutions that are built with a diversity of perspectives that take into account what they don't know, what they could know, and they have the humility and creativity to be open to change as sort of new information becomes available.
Yeah. Thanks, Layla. Daniel.
Yeah, so I think the word durability that you used really is really where I was coming to this question from. The work that we've been doing at the Steelcase Foundation for the last almost 4 years now has really been about building durability. There was, in sort of a society that has all these viral moments and everyone's sort of running to a thing. It's like little kid soccer, where everyone's sort of running to the ball. We were really trying to continue to ask ourselves every day, how do we interrogate our own systems, our own structures? What are we doing that's getting in the way of, who do we need to talk to? Who do we need to listen from? Who's needed to transform? And that's really what kind of has been driving our work to think about how we build the appropriate infrastructure so that we can have durability moving forward, so that we're not just sort of responding to whatever the thing is, whatever is kind of floating around in that moment. And for us, that meant sort of really landing on this idea of felt difference, trying to move away from these high-level metrics and things that can sometimes create false positives, false success. We're moving wages from $17 an hour with this population to $19 an hour, and when we do it, we pat ourselves on the back and say, look what we did. But the felt difference for that parent might be that now that increase meant moving their job a little bit, and now they get off at 6 and they can't pick up their kids, and that created a whole host of other things. We do this with education, third grade reading conversations around, we need to test, and maybe some of that gets a slight bump, but kids are like, all we do is test. I don't like school. Well, what does it mean if we have a whole bunch of first, second, and third graders who don't enjoy school, don't want to go to school anymore? There's felt difference implications, and so that's part of what we are seeing as our future-proofing work as a foundation is building the infrastructure to think about our work as learning and supporting felt difference, so that continues on past me while I'm there, past our board members, past any one of us, that this is the way that we're moving forward.
Well, I'm going to stick with you in Grand Rapids in Michigan for a second, and I love the durability, the adaptability, as well also when and how do we call out? And I'm and as you think about yesterday, we talked about change capital, human, intellectual, and social capital. And in your leadership, kind of journey, and then the post that you're holding now, but also with Daniel, the leader, and your own values. How are you thinking about ways of future-proofing or even provocation when you're thinking about civic leadership, social trust, in a place like in Michigan? Certainly people paying a lot of attention to Michigan. Grand Rapids has special, as all places do, history and opportunities. How is that, how are you, because you're at the center of that future building and proofing from a relational perspective. Can you go a little bit deeper?
Maybe. I think I understood the question. If I don't, just catch me, reel me back in.
You got it.
In general, I think it's really been about how are we thinking about how we're talking about the work.
Yeah.
And when I talk about interrogation, which isn't a new word, but it's really kind of this tension between sort of the windows and mirrors, right? We spend a lot of time looking out windows and, and critiquing what's happening, and not enough time looking in mirrors and critiquing what we're doing, one. Two, I think this idea around sort of critical curiosity and critical care in everything that we're doing, that there's sort of this push right now that just being critical of something is the work, right? Or just, we'll point a finger and say, that's not it, that's not right, you're not doing it, and then sort of sit back and like, I did my job. And that isn't the end. That's not, it's important to be critical, but if we're not critical with curiosity, with open hands, wanting to learn, with the beginner's mindset, if we're not critical with care and thinking about how we engage with various populations who are there, and going back to this idea of felt difference, like what they feel is real to them. And so working to understand that, working to both be critical of our systems and our structures and the way that we're interacting, but doing it in a way that's both curious and with care.
Yeah, no, that's super powerful. And it was part of, I wanted to kind of bring in, like, because we're all sitting in these places in our leadership and when we're going home, and how that curiosity, but like, and the tension. And I love the felt difference, and there's a felt difference, and also the felt experiences, and the different experiences that got us to where we are, that feel differently or experience differently, and how we all can have more 360, and certainly with an equity lens. But then going back to you, Julie, where you've talked about, and this is your expertise, our words, our language, is the narrative serving us well, and how can we be thinking about kind of the narrative, but then to the conversations and setting the tables? How can we be future-proofing, using language to our advantage, and the one part weaving in there, which we've different conversations, like when we are not allowed to even use certain words. We're also at a time, as we're trying to future-proof and use language, books are being banned, words are being stricken.
I think one of the things we need to future-proof for is the reality that manufactured controversies will be part of our world. And so we need to have shared, reliable, effective strategies for responding when the next made-up thing comes, right? And it can't be, oh my gosh, we don't do that made-up thing, right? But needs to be a strong affirmative narrative about what is true, what our values are, how we're doing this work, why we're doing this work. And so that sense of being, if we think of the definition of future-proofing as being proactive and thoughtful ahead of time, knowing that some shock will come. One of the shocks that is going to come for your field now, if it hasn't already, right, are these manufactured controversies, a la so-called CRT, or book banning, or anti-trans legislation, et cetera. And so knowing that that comes and having those strategies ready, leading with a shared value, humanizing the groups that are being scapegoated or demonized in those moments. There's just some, and not restating the shorthand, and instead landing on your own language about what is true and what you are doing.
Yeah. Thank you, Julie. And later I'd love for also maybe an example of where you've seen that done really well. Might be really great. Reggie, you look like you wanted to pop in.
I was thinking about the LGBTQ movement, and particularly marriage equality, and the shift that happened in a change in dialogue, a change in narrative around to more towards marriage equality, and how that made a significant shift in our society, and how people thought about people of the same gender being legally bound together. And I think that might be an example of using narrative to help us move an agenda forward. I struggle with, and Ann, you and I have been around a long time, a minute or two.
A minute. Well, we were just born yesterday too.
Do you ever,
we popped up.
I was just,
Oh, boy.
sometimes when I'm like just being alone and reflecting and closing my eyes and envisioning what I look like and where I am,
I'm
I
scared.
look a lot like Daniel. It's interesting.
Hence not sitting next to each other.
It's weird. It's like doppelganger right there.
That's a special future proofing.
I think that there's a special art that I have yet to master in knowing when to call in and knowing when to call out. Because if I choose to call out, I run the risk of alienating. I run the risk of pushing people away. I run the risk of, we do a lot of work at APHSA around belonging. And I run the risk of what we call othering. You are there because I'm calling you out. Calling in to me means finding common ground. Where can we connect? What do we believe or share? We may not believe on that. We may need to get more data to help us understand one another and to talk to one another to better understand. But there are times when we simply have to call out. It is so wrong. It is so offensive. It is so moving us in the wrong direction that it's unacceptable to not call out. But it is, to me, an art, not a science, on how we do that.
Yeah, no, that, I couldn't agree more. And it's one where Dr. Elka Hatter was leading a great conversation yesterday around sort of public-private community partnerships and how we're doing inside-outside strategies with the group yesterday. And you know, we're not very diverse communities in political context. And I'm curious, in the work you've done from Colorado to nationally to Wisconsin, where you called out, called in, or also when I think about vintage Reggie Bika moves, there's a lot of when do you break bread and have the relationship so you're not breaking the relationship because you have a different point of view, if you're kind of, whether you're trying to think about principled persuasions or helping one see differently, where it can be very adversarial and very zero-sum, like you're going to the legislature or to Congress now. How can relationship, or ways you can call out, or maybe you can encourage people to
Relationships is a powerful word right there. And I have learned over time, sometimes through very difficult lessons, about the importance of communicating early and often, particularly with people that we may have some differences with. You mentioned the legislature. I don't know if you know that I had some problems with the legislature during I was the executive director for the Colorado Department of Human Services for 8 years and had some legislative challenges. And one of the things that I had to do was to go and meet with every member of the General Assembly to reconnect, to learn, to understand. It's 100-some people. But we did it over a summer. I did it over a summer.
I remember.
Began having conversations every month with the chairs of my committees in the Senate and in the House. One was controlled by the Republican Party, one by the Democrat Party. And the list goes on of different ways that I had to think with intentionality about how do I build connections. Sometimes people just, in these legislators, they just wanted to know what was going on sooner rather than later. They didn't want to be blindsided. They wanted to be engaged and heard by the administration, not felt like they were over there and we were doing our own thing. And I think it's that importance of building relationships that allows us to do so many other things in the movement.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so, and I want to make sure we leave a lot of time for also some conversation and questions. But before we go there, I mean, Layla, I'd really love for you to kind of go a little deep with both when Future Caucus started as the Millennial Action Project. It was a big idea, and it was kind of an act of future faith. I mean, you really stepped out with a vision and a way of doing it where this political polarization could there be a way that there could be more purpose, more relationship, ways to work through difference and respect it, but still do good policy or governance? Can you share just a bit of the journey of Future Caucus and what you've seen working directly on political culture, political leaders across aisles and communities and states?
Yeah. I think something that Reggie said, that the word relationships, right? And when do you call in, when do you call out? That only happens if you have trust. Only happens if you have trust. I'm sure it's been said, this conference, like, change moves at the speed of trust. And right now we are suffering from a crisis of trust inside legislatures and between communities and legislatures. And so the notion of Future Caucus, then Millennial Action Project, really was, how do we get at this underlying crisis of trust? And the answer is, it starts with people. And this is actually super radical and a very shocking notion, but it turns out elected officials are people too. It's
Are
crazy. 100% of them.
We were wondering
yeah.
if funders were people too, that Daniel's trying to represent.
They're all
Teasing,
people.
teasing.
And so some of the really core activities that help us deprogram our assumptions about what other people believe are breaking bread, are going and spending time with one another. We're millennials and Gen Zers, so we go like axe throwing and do happy hours and wine nights. Well, wine is cross-generational.
I see.
And it's because this sort of the way our political institutions really are set up is this like tug of war where there's two poles and we're pulling the rope in opposite directions, and every now and then somebody like pulls it a little bit harder, but what that leads to is a lot of instability and institutions that often either swing, like the pendulum swings from one side to the other, and we don't really get time to live into the solutions and policies that are being written, or entire communities or voices don't get to be a part of sort of the decision-making process. And so what we thought was what if you could pull the rope sideways? What if you could think of a new dimension in which you are actually thinking through what it means to be solving problems, what it means to be inside our institutions, not on a left-right framework, but what about a future-past axis? And so Future Caucus really is about how do we come at problem solving, not from the scarcity mindset that is sort of the left-right paradigm, but this future past, as young people, what is the abundance mindset of what we bring, this energy, these fresh ideas, this open-mindedness, and what could that, regardless of what political party, regardless of, urban, rural, gender, anything, what can you bring in that mindset, and how does that build a new kind of coalition that sort of disrupts the stalemate that we're in, that keeps us stuck? Because I think the opposite of future-proofing is stuck in the mud, and we feel stuck in the mud. Something that we launched last year with the help of Ascend and the Aspen Institute is something called the Innovation Lab, which sort of operationalizes this idea. Because at the end of the day, we're dealing with elected leaders. I can't go to them and be like, we should operate with an abundance mindset and future-proof the world. And they're going to be like, Layla, what are you talking about? And so what the Innovation Lab does is it's a set of very specific policy solutions, policy ideas. Many of the people in this room have actually helped co-create that agenda. And bipartisan groups of lawmakers now workshop in their states and with each other, how do we build coalitions with this end in mind, with these outcomes in mind. The first 3 fellowships that we launched within the Innovation Lab were around modernizing democracy, renewable energy, and a prenatal to 3 fellowship, which, again, thanks to Ascend. And it's just been incredible to see the appetite to be able to operate in this new way of being in relation to each other, and this new sense of agency when it comes to thinking of ourselves as problem solvers. And at the end of the day, if you go back to that, what we said at the beginning, they're people too. We're all people, and we all want to feel like we belong to something bigger, that we have purpose, and that we are contributing to making the world a better place. Most people run for office because of that. Thinking about how do I apply an abundance mindset, how do I actually build new coalitions that lead to durable outcomes, that have buy-in from the outset from a lot of different people, and how do I do that with the community too? For us, that has been a really exciting reason to sit, I can stand here on the stage right now and say I'm hopeful for the future of our politics because I get to see so much of that. And the last thing I'll say is just a data point. Last year, only about 25% of state legislators are young, and we're saying 45 and under is young. Yeah.
The Aspen Institute.
Okay, I guess
No,
it's
the
like
Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute used to be like, if you're under 50. We've been working on that.
Yeah. Well, I also said we don't check IDs, so
teasing.
like get your moisturizer in check and like you're in. But so they're only 25% were young. They wrote 40% of bipartisan legislation that got signed into law by the governor.
All right, that's cool.
So they are punching above their weight when it comes to building these coalitions. And if we can find a way to really institutionalize that attitude and that approach to solving problems, we can be in a much more productive place when it comes to building the political will for building long-term solutions.
No, that's a perfect, gosh, I love how you wrap that up. And it's one where I say this would be, at least over the past, kind of chapters of the past 10, 15 years that I have seen proven out. That, truly all folks, and you said this, want to be part of something larger. Something a little bit larger than themselves. It might look a little bit different or feel differently. Just as we know that all families, however they define themselves, really want the best for their family, their community, but also truly their children. In all of the decades I've been swinging at the fences, I have never met any family, parent, caregiver, anywhere in the world that has ever said, I'm looking for the best governmental program. I'm looking for the best service. Everyone is looking to be the best family, to have control, to have agency, to contribute, and to be part of something larger, as well as leaders. Like when we looked at even just from 10 years then and now, and even when I think about the work with, that Ascend the network, our policy partners, our fellows, grant advisors and funders, it's resonant in ways in red, blue, and purple states, communities, rural, and suburban, geographic, and urban, and sort of across the board. But when Reggie said, the call out, because I do think there are times when we're all leaders at the table, we have to say what needs to be said, how to say it in ways that it might lead towards actions. But what are ways, like when you're saying the Future Caucus, we're 45% of the productive bipartisan legislation getting passed. You've created something that people want to be a part of. I keep, I'm a carrot girl, like stick, carrot stick. Like, I just know that I'm just at my most frustrated. If it's a stick, it's just like, that means I'm shot. We live in the world of and you do want to have the sticks in the regulation, but in a lot of the space we are, what does it look like to incent, to inspire people? And you got to have the regulation, so don't get me wrong. But I'm curious, Reggie, you're sitting at APHSA. You've been with a group of folks in so many different ways, but whether it's Christine Norbert in New Jersey, Raquel Hatter when she was in Tennessee, and Raquel transcends any perch or role, but the leaders have been on the front line of human services, which is a $1 trillion lever for families. How are you future-proofing that for families? How are you thinking about that going forward from where you've been to where you go? Hearing about putting the path forward so people want to be a part of it.
Love that, Ann. Jeff Pirtle, I think, is here also from
Yeah,
Wisconsin,
Wisconsin.
Department of Children and Families.
Minnesota.
And Tiki Brown. Oh, there's Jeff and Tiki Brown from Minnesota and Laura from Washington, D.C. I'm just calling out members because I may have to call them next week for dues. So I'm just wanting to lift that up. Laura's like, yes, we know. A couple of things. I have heard the story so many times, and you reiterated it again, that the two-gen movement is one that everyone along the political spectrum can embrace. They might embrace it from slightly different angles, with slightly different justifications, with different levels of priorities, but it's something that Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, progressives, people in the faith-based community, people in the middle, they can all grab onto a piece of it and hold it and say, yes, this is where I am. And it is trying to find that connection that we do at APHSA to engage state leaders on a common set of priorities, focus areas that lift our shared customers, consumers, clients up, in the way that they want to be lifted up, that we can mutually work together to identify federal policy changes. And our federal partners really need to be a part of this effort, this movement, and helping them understand and find a way that will help us at the state and local level to be able to make changes. But it's also about building coalitions with other organizations like Ascend, and connecting the dots. Anne served on the board of APHSA prior to my arrival. I just came in February, so I think she bolted before I came on. But and was honored as our national award winner a few years ago, Jerry W. Friedman Award. I tell you all of that to say it's about building those sorts of connections with like-minded organizations, because we can do more together than we can as individual organizations. And it's about, an important part of my work is lifting up the story of our state and local organizations and the work that they're doing all over the country, and using those examples as proof points, justifications. They say states are the laboratories of democracy. There is a ton of innovation, creativity, unique strategies that are going on across the country at the state and local levels. And how do we identify them, tell the story, paint the picture so that others can do more of it, and we can demonstrate to leaders, policymakers, the importance of moving in this forward direction. And then two things, and then I'll be very quick. One is I challenged you to use that as an example, that all of us can go back to our communities, whether we're a small nonprofit, a state agency, a county agency, a faith-based organization, and we can begin to build a community by bringing people together who share this belief in a two-gen approach of lifting up people who are struggling to get out of poverty and stay there for multiple generations. We can create these types of convenings that Ascend is creating for us to be together to create communities locally. And I had one more point that I have all of a sudden forgotten, because that's what happens.
2 points. You gotta just
I should have just said 1 point, and then you all would have been like, oh, that's genius, and then I'd have been off the hook. And now you're all going to be like, what was the other point? Back to you, Ann.
Oh, we love that transparency and vulnerability. Well, if the mic runners can be ready to get going for kind of questions, and that will go in a second. And I just thought as we're on this discussion and bring in, just really broaden the conversation, because one of the things about future-proofing or future building is also about widening the lens. But Julie, as we widen the lens, you've been on this path with this two-gen community about narrative. What are, one, two, or three short, advice points you have when you're thinking about using language to help future-proof? And then Daniel, I'm going to have you do just 1, 2, or 3, whatever you can. When you're thinking about it from kind of what philanthropy can do, and even connected or not to some of the community, public, private partnership kind of ideas you've been noodling with. And then we'll close out with you two, and then go to large group conversation.
Well, I'll pick up on Reggie's final and brilliant point. I would have picked up on the other one, but we don't know what it was. So, but the importance of coalition, and so one that you're telling narratives not on your own, but as part of a cross-sector, cross-organization coalition. And to your question earlier, Anne, about where have I seen kind of the response to a manufactured controversy go well, it has been only in coalitions and groups that have come together across spaces, across roles, things like the Free to Be, Free to Learn coalition, where they're pushing back on some of those attacks on schools with school leaders, with school board folks, with education advocates, with parents, and it's working together. That's the only way that can work. So working together is the first thing. Thinking about who you're using your language with. Right now, you just kind of from where I sit on the periphery, an occasional guest, at Ascend, you all are brilliant and crushing it on the inside game, right? At the state level, at the local level, you are changing the systems from within. I see a little less emphasis at this point on the outside game, on ensuring that the general public understands and knows the value of your new approach to how you're supporting children and families. And building in public will and public understanding is one of those key ways to administration proof, right? You may lose your champion or your leader now, but if the public is saying, hey, we want that way, we want it to go that way, we understand what this is, we value what this is, it's really hard for those hard-fought wins to be rolled back. And then finally, remembering that narratives are a means to an end. What you're trying to do is move mindsets, shift the mental models that keep insufficient programs and systems in place to mental models that create the space for the transformed types of systems you all are imagining. And so focusing on remembering that you're trying to move just a few key mindsets, you all have already named them. We're moving away from a deservingness mindset where you have to prove you're super, super worthy to get any help, right, to a more universal human development, right? We need to be fostering the potential of all families and children, and we have effective ways to do that. So thinking about those mindsets and those mental models you need to move, and how you're going to do that in coalition, and how you're going to do that in the public sphere, not only the system, the inside the system sphere.
Super helpful. Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the coalition part is such a big deal, and I don't think that we can or should or ever minimize the role of this kind of network, right? This number of people who all represent a whole other group of people who are connected to a whole bunch of other people. It's thousands of leaders and organizations and co-conspirators who are all together kind of rowing in the same direction. And as Reggie said, there may be slight differences in how we show up or how we see it or whatnot. But like in general, there's this connected tissue that's helping work as a way to help kind of slingshot work forward. And there's so many examples, especially when we think about how we make this connection between, public-private partnerships and ways that we find and work through language that we're not inventing this thing. I'm not sitting in Grand Rapids like, how do I come up with a word to say that, that there's research that's been done and there's thousands of people who've been trying things and that we're sharing and that can leverage our work moving forward, and that coalition provides strength. If you're on your own on a hill waving a flag, you can be taken down. But when you're a part of a larger network of people who are all waving the same flags, who are all saying the same things, who are all moving in the same direction, it's much more difficult to start to pick those people off one by one. A few really specific examples just in this network, right? We have been doing work with Dr. Garfield around the Prams for Dads work, which then led to conversations at the state. We're having conversations statewide of how do we get this? That's continuing to move. But that was because of some work that we were doing around thinking about moms who earn right at the cusp of the benefits cliff, and thinking about what does it look like to do a longitudinal work around there, not the sort of fleeting nature that philanthropy often does of these 1, 2, and 3 year cycles, but what does it look like to invest in a cohort of moms for 10 years? But to do that, we reached out to Springboard, right? And we were like, hey, we're thinking about this. What have you learned? We brought a group of people from Grand Rapids to visit Dr. Willis and Joe Jones in Maryland. We just hosted a convening last week with Joe Waters and Capita, centered on a summit of children and families. Those things don't happen just because. They happen because we've been here, we've shared space, we have conversations, we know what each other are doing. When I'm saying I think we're kind of pulling the string on felt difference, and how do we start to operationalize what felt difference means? And Joe says, hey, well, we're doing this work with Harvard Making Caring Common around loneliness and disconnection and why people are feeling that. And we're seeing what this means for fathers, and we're seeing what this means for parents, and we're seeing what this means for working parents in Michigan specifically, and how corporate entities need to be thinking about this. All of this is interrelated, and it does mean something to be able to bring this sort of group of people in to be able to help solidify the message, and that's really important. The other piece is this safety, right? There's absolutely the question of when do you push, and when do you call out, when do you call in. constantly trying to balance, not sort of conflating calling in with like giving your position, like back, like retreating, like those are really difficult spaces that we're trying to navigate. Many folks have come into spaces specifically to change management. Many of us might be the first person of color even in that position and do change management and change the system that other people feel really comfortable with, even though they said they wanted you to come in and change it, right? Like all of that is real. And so that balance is hard, that tension is difficult, and there's going to be times where we don't get it right. There's going to be a moment where, we miscalculate in a situation, we push harder than we could have or should have. And what is the role of a network like this to capture and catch and provide that sort of soft landing for folks who are out trying to do the work every day and may need someone to say, like, hey, all right, I pushed too far, I'm looking for something. Here's a whole network of people who can help because we know we're all there. And so I think the safety in a kind of network like this is really important.
Yeah, super powerful.
One other thing I want to add, if I could, Ann, is allowing the kids and families that we are serving to tell their own story. Bringing them to the table in real and meaningful and authentic ways to be a part of helping us to develop solutions, but also to communicate with decision makers, with the public about their experience and what they need, what they're achieving, what they're doing in their own words. One of the last things that I did when I left Colorado, the Department of Human Services, and I wish it had been the first thing that I did, was to create a family voice council. Folks from all across our department who come together on a regular basis. I'm pleased to say 5-6 years later, it's still in place and stronger than ever. To be I'll be candid with you, at the time it was to be a counterweight to advocates, county agencies, and others who had an incredible amount of power with policymakers, but we never heard the perspectives of consumers. So we created this Family Voice Council to be that. That being there and continuing for administrations, they are telling their own stories about what they need. They are influencing whoever the executive director of the agency is and their staff. Yeah. They're able to go speak in a coordinated way at the legislature and other places. It's really important. I was so pleased to see it as a challenge for governors.
Yeah, I can't wait to have a partner with APA to say on that.
Let's do it, man.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Well, man, woman. Well, going from this today, we are going to a conversation with everyone. That part around the family council and the lived experience, and it's coming out just in throughout different experiences as well. Really, we can just look at that one jump off example for kind of, I think, the learning and the intentionality around Ascend. The voices, the lived experience, expertise, and wisdom. And I, kind of think about how we even think about solutions, words, moments, because we all have experience, like getting, the stories, but truly the recommendations, because you're also going to get better policy, and wisdom, sort of probably better community and connection. And not only are we going to get better policy or answers, or also think about workforce and building not just community, led to being of community in some ways for organizations, but we're going to have a stronger democracy. We're going to have a stronger democracy. And that's another, as a future question I have for later when we think about the work we're all doing. What might be if we had some aspect we either partnered differently or thought about how we thought about civic vitality as part of our work and leadership even more deliberately. But
Anne, can I just pick up on that point?
you sure
really
can.
quick?
And then someone raise your hands because we are bringing the conversation. Yes, Julie.
The point about family voice being a way to strengthen democracy, agree with that, absolutely. It's also a story America needs to hear about how your approach is more democratic and that it allows for better representation. So in our research on how culture is changing, America is losing its faith in democracy and losing its mental model of what it is. People think it's just voting, and therefore they think it's just politics, and therefore they think it's broken, and they don't want to be part of it, or they want to be on this team or that team. But democracy is more than that. And one of the ideas that it cuts across the nation, across political affiliation, across age, is this idea that a democracy should be representative. It should represent the will of the people. People should be included. And so you're doing that.
Yeah.
People need to hear that story so they can remember that we can do that. We are doing that, and it makes a difference when we do it. So it's not just a game changer for you all. Can be a frame changer for America.
Not just a game changer, a frame changer.
Yeah, you see what I did there?
Damn.
I just thought that up right here too.
Yeah, that was priceless. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Joe, and if folks can, as they ask their questions, just don't mind introducing themselves, name an organization, and maybe if you want, where you're from. Joe.
Joe Waters, Capita from North Carolina. I'd just love to hear from each of you one trend or signal of change that you might be interested in or even obsessed with that you think the rest of us need to be paying more attention to.
Good question. Who's most
I'll
obsessed?
start because mine's depressing a little bit, and then hopefully these other folks can come and play cleanup. But one thing that I said, I'm really hopeful because we see this promise inside of our institutions to steward a better way of doing democracy, and I do just deeply feel, right, it's in our charter, a more perfect union. It's not an end state, it's a continual improvement, and that requires a healthy civic flywheel where communities and the elected leaders are working together to co-create and generate and improve upon solutions so that communities can thrive. And I feel hopeful because I see the next generation of leaders with this capacity and appetite to do that. And I'm starting to see a very worrying trend of a retention crisis of people who are in elected office for maybe 1 or 2 terms and feel fed up or frustrated or not supported, frankly. And there's a lot of sort of policy reasons, I think, at the state level where it's really hard to serve in elected office. Obviously, toxic polarization plays a big part. There's threats. If you're a young parent, it's really hard to have young kids and serve. You often have multiple jobs. And so I'm starting to be really concerned about this retention crisis. We're doing a great job recruiting people and saying you should run for office, and we're doing a really bad job of retaining them. And I think that could metastasize the polarization crisis and our ability to get solutions. Sorry.
Womp womp.
I'm usually the hopeful person. So.
One of the things that popped in my head, Joe, when you asked that question is, we were talking earlier around being critical without sort of in thinking that's the end, right? That's the work. And one of the things that I think might be coming out, that I'm hopeful is coming out of this backlash to critical race theory, book bans, school. Coming to school board meetings and all the work that's been happening around there. I'm hopeful that part of the counterbalance to that is people, young people, and across the spectrum are starting to realize that we have to use our positionality, our areas where we have opportunity to make movement. We have to do that consistently. We have to use our discretionary space in the positions that we're in to help move some of these conversations, to solidify the work, to fight back in whatever ways we can. And the reason why I think this is sort of a slight shift is there's been this sense that I have felt, and I've participated in it many times, where whatever the system, the structure is, it's like the board won't let us do that, right? I don't know. Well, we've got these procedures we have to follow. Like there's all these reasons why we can't do something. The reality for me, what I'm continuing to discover is that there's so much room. There's such a gap. There's so much room in discretionary space for me. Like, I have complete control over what organizations I talk to, how I write it up for the board, what the 3-year plan is for what I have the board read and what they're thinking about and how I'm framing this thing and how we make this connection, who I bring in to have them. Like, I have so much discretion in that. And I have to. It's like, it's urgent to work towards that shifting and not sitting back and just like, the board will never go for that. Like, no, we have to create that. And so I do think that there's this history, especially in education, especially with Black educators and Black women specifically, using their spaces to push against these systems and question, and using their time that they have with young people or others. And I think that's something that we can really learn from in this moment, as there's been this sort of this backlash against that, to leverage that to help motivate and mobilize people to leverage their discretionary space.
Oh, that's a great one. Thoughts?
Well, mine is a little related, so I'll go after you if that's okay. And the signal that I'm watching and a little obsessed with is the rise or increased temperature around scapegoating of different groups, and what I hope to be the commensurate and response of what you were talking about of using our discretionary power to humanize, right? To remember that we are creating a sense of belonging. We are actively working in all of our communications and all of our outreach and all of our policies and programs to ensure that we're not demonizing certain groups of people, whether that's immigrants, whether that's trans folks, whether that's people of color, whether that's people who participate in government programs, right? All of those groups are really being called out in a very harmful way. And that is a signal for lots of other dominoes that can fall in a democracy in a bad way. So that's something I'm watching a lot.
Joe, there are so many things. The first thing that popped into my mind was a Denver Broncos win tonight. But I don't think that's what you were looking for. Moving human services, the thought about human services, to human potential. That we have to step on the gas to move our approaches in the human services sector, broadly speaking, to be much more focused on prevention, early intervention, much more focused on early childhood and community-based approaches, and shifting our philosophies away from models that really have us waiting until a kid has been harmed to intervene, waiting until a family has hit a catastrophic point in their life before they get access to services that could support them, et cetera. Related to that also is we have to change our paradigm in this country around public assistance. Our systems were never designed to move people out of poverty into the middle class. Politicians say that all the time, but they were clearly designed simply to keep people from death, essentially. Or to mitigate some of the impacts of death. And if we change our philosophy to say we are going to build a public assistance infrastructure that is intended to keep people from getting into poverty and to move them out of poverty in a holistic way into the middle class, that would be a game changer for our country, I think.
Nice, nice. Other questions, comments? Laura? And Mike is coming on your way, and then we'll go back there.
Thank you. I'm Laura Zeilinger, Director of Human Services in DC. Great panel. Thank you. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to just pick one. Really sort of a more meta question around future-proofing. And so as someone who's had a longer tenure than most in a human services agency, going on 10 years, I was thinking a lot about how we tell our story in an authentic way, because in my experience working in the public sector, that what gives us the most credibility is what we've accomplished, to show that these problems are not actually intractable, they're solvable. And I agree with you, Reggie, about the government human services framework that's set up, and I would not just say that's set up to keep people from worse harm, but in a way it's set up to keep people where they are, and benefit cliffs is a really important example of that. And so we need to tell an honest narrative. And so what are your suggestions about how we are effective storytellers and at convening people, bringing people together in the ways that were talked about, to tell the story that shows the success we've had, where we've come from, and some of what you've talked about, Anne, about where this movement's been over the last 10 years, that also sets a stage about and energizes people about what's next. Because I think if we either get stuck in talking about what's wrong, or we feel on the defensive to be able to explain what we've done well. And so how do you have that balance that achieves a sense of possibility?
So I'm a DC resident. Thank you for all you do for our community. I can see as a local, right, and trust that since you're here, you're doing amazing things. I think that point of what we've accomplished as a source of credibility is one, that's a key insight. Another aspect of credibility is you're not telling your own story. People are telling it with and for you, right, in a way. And so one question I have, not knowing your communication strategy at all, is to what extent are you enlisting and partnering with the very robust NGO sector and the advocates that are often pushing you from the outside to make changes, but can they be part of your storytelling infrastructure? Because I think that they've got trust in a way, right, that government can't always have, not through no fault of your own, just through the narratives we're in. And there's a point of having someone else validating, a third-party validator is part of that. And I'd love to have a more in-depth conversation with you afterwards, because we've got some more specific tools and techniques that could be helpful in that.
The only thing I'll add is, has anyone been on a really bad date ever? Part of what makes it bad is the person is just like talking about themselves the whole time, and they don't ask you a single question, and you feel like, okay, great, I learned all about this person, but they clearly don't care about me. Even if they're on a date with you, they're trying, bad. That's a bad date strategy. I think it's also a bad communication strategy. And so the lesson is, how are we sort of demonstrating and closing the feedback loop about how we're listening at the beginning and being really, really clear about how the story we're telling is reflecting back what we heard from others. And one story I think about from our work is in Oklahoma. Our Future Caucus co-chairs decided to work on a harm reduction bill to tackle the opioid epidemic, and decided to advance a pretty controversial idea of a needle exchange bill. And they wanted to do it, and what the Republican co-chair, Rep. Daniel Pay, did was he did listening tours in the community and heard from the police union that 1 in 3 police officers were harmed by a needle stick injury in their career. And so when they wrote the bill and ultimately secured a win, they were able to go back, he was able to go back to the police and say this was a back the blue bill, even though it had generated from sort of his counterpart on the left. And so I just think about that storytelling, how you're getting buy-in, how then you use that to inform what you do, and then going back to people not in a one-directional like marketing way, but in a closing the feedback loop way.
Nice. Yolanda.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yolanda, parent ambassador for Aspen. That's because I'm the oldest. But thank you so much for this panel, and thank you so much for opening doors to help us understand what our future really might look like, right? And so, working so hard in New York City in the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. Okay, but don't hold it against me. I do want you to answer for me, which is a very dangerous question, especially being a parent advisor and learning and developing and doing it for so many years, but still yet learning to say call in and call out. Now, Reggie has somewhat of the personality of Yolanda, so I can't imagine.
Poor thing.
When I open my mouth, could you give me some clear examples of effective calling in and calling out, and why sometimes that might not quite be as effective depending on who it's coming from. And again, let me be clear, I work for the Mayor's Office of New York City, and I do all of homeless housing for formerly incarcerated individuals. So that is always a fight. So just give me some great examples of what you guys have done. Thank you.
Great examples of calling in. Well, one, I was just thinking about Layla's example of the police officer and the needles, where you could call them out and create opposition, or you could call them in and find a solution with the right sort of language that allowed you to get to the shared end that you were trying to get to, but do it for a narrative that is completely different from one another. So I think that's a really good example. You mentioned homelessness. I have only worked in homelessness a small amount, but I do know that businesses in my community in Denver get very irritated that there are homeless people living outside their streets. They literally sometimes can't get into their own establishments because there's someone sleeping in an entryway or on the sidewalk out there. They could call out, or we could call them out for not caring about the homeless, or we could understand their experience of dealing with the homeless situation and find common ground that could allow us to bridge an opportunity to find new solutions that could keep that homeless person sheltered and thus off of the street and impacting their business if we can create those sort of connections rather than pointing fingers at each other or trying to other the other person. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Jeff Pirtle from Wisconsin. He's a Badger, so I know this is going to be a good question right here. Come on, Jeff.
Well, I'm a successor of Reggie's, so he can claim me all day long if he wants to. It's actually more a reflection on some work that we did when I was on the county board and thinking about the work, Layla, that you were talking about the power of like critical mass. And in Wisconsin, in county boards, the average county board member is over 65. A lot of them meet during the day, precluding any working person from being involved. And when I served on the board, we had a third of us had school-age kids, a bunch of us had kids under 10, and it really showed up in both the culture and the policies that we adopted. So I would bring my kids to meetings, and we allowed breastfeeding on the board floor. We, passed paid parental leave for our staff, and enacted a bunch of things that we just felt like were parenting in public spaces decisions. And it was interesting that some folks were like, "Oh, you are these radical people," and it just really struck this idea for me about when we were in a space where there were lots of people who were parents who shared different kinds of experiences or different thoughts about them, those all felt very normal. And that normalization created a power and a culture that let us do things that made people's lives better. In our own human services agency, we carry a lot of that forward. Our post-pandemic work about family-friendly employment and remote work has really cut our turnover rate. We've slashed our pay gaps, and all of that has improved our employee retention. And it was just about having a leadership that was made up of people who were part of children and families. And it's just, I think, a really powerful idea. I know there's some folks who are running for public office. Please, please, please do that. Because it makes a huge difference in who's making those decisions. And then it's not an agenda, it's just community and life.
Yeah.
I think the more you normalize it, it is part of the bloodstream, right, of what's happening. It doesn't take so much energy and effort to try to push something, but it's part of the culture. And I think right now what we're seeing is a lot of, us in this room trying to push something that's kind of counterculture, but as you grow and as more people sort of are a part of that critical mass, it is the culture. And I think that's what's really exciting about everything we're talking about in terms of coalition building and a network of networks is getting to that tipping point where there's a critical mass.
Yeah, and I know we're getting close to close, and I just, Jeff, I love that point. And it's sort of one where, when I think about language that we used to name what I and others were seeing in the world at that time, being really forceful about our systems have been historically antiquated, fragmented, racially, gender, economically, and and really in that space and really naming it. And I still think it's really important how we're naming and knowing, yet at times also how are we normalizing and modernizing. And so I'm sort of putting this out, then I'm gonna ask each of you to give like a closing sort of statement for like on the future proofing as we go out here. But so I'm gonna throw out a couple things, and please also if there's anything that I'm gonna close out with, add in. But this piece, if we're spending all this time, like what's innovative, what's best practice, what's next practice, I'm really like, what's expected practice? And who is setting the rules? Like in the state of Maryland, we had, I think it was the city council and a woman elected leader who couldn't come to all of the meetings because had a newborn breastfeeding, and so it was virtually. And a lot of the male were like, we don't do that. Well, okay, if it's an all-male world, maybe, but even not. It's not. That's like a bad frame making. But this part of changing, or even I think about Melvin Carter, the mayor of St. Paul, where he said, I am bringing St. Paul into the mayor's office. And a lot of people got super uncomfortable. And he was like, what's up? We're the house of the people. And I use them just like to your piece, because for how we're doing any kinds of our work, how are our structures, our designs, our words, like showing, not telling, where the world is now, but then also going forward. And so I put that out there. And my two kind of like last comments I'll kind of put out here, actually it's gonna be super quick, and then we'll go down, Daniel, if I can, just for you all to have a closing pearl of wisdom. But one is, Julie, I love that you said we are crushing it internally. Crushing it. And one part on that lens, we've had recent conversations that actually came from a Republican senator coming back to say, I want to get back on the Two-Generation Economic Empowerment Act, which is we don't do that much like congressional work because I'm not going to say anything. But have specifically said, we want to come back to this. And I was saying to the team, I don't even, like, whatever was in it, I care what we want to put in it. And so, like, what do we want to put in, whether it's that and how it can also be model legislation, not only for Congress, but also for states. And so I put that out really publicly with all of you to see Marjorie or Andrea Camp or, or myself to just like give your ideas. I really want to think about what we proactively want to put forward to help any congressional person do a good job in their job. And of course, think about their values and also tribal sovereignty. And there's also so there's other things, but like there's ways that we can keep leveraging this internal, and like later this month on the 29th, the acting Secretary of Labor, Julie Sue, had specifically called out, because the Department of Labor is going to be releasing some very important economic research on childcare, GDP, and childcare workforce. And she's like, I want to release that with assent. I was like, go team, crushing it, metric. We're felt metric, our win. But we want you to come and have a conversation with parents and caregivers and people on the front line. And so I just like how we're thinking about those moments that we can weave them together and lift up. And but I also really want to call out, it's also a gift for you to say, we're not crushing it on how we're telling the story more broadly publicly. That's just awesome. So I thank you for also naming that for us, and also saying like how with family story, how are we taking that where we've got the popular support, public support, how might we think about being a much stronger chorus and not a cacophony, but a chorus where we have all of from soprano, alto, bass, take it on, but that, you got it, not my thing. No, it is. But anyhow, so I sort of put that to all of you as we have our next couple of day and a half here to really lean into what we pragmatically want to do to future-proof and future build. And so I know we're wrapping up, so just your last words of wisdom and maybe marching opportunities to build that future.
The last bit is sticking with me, so like bear with me as I'm like thinking through what I think about this. But I think the example that was used around, we're here. This is, and it's just as striking me as often we talk about lived experience. We talk about it's like, what do we mean when we're saying that, and like who do we mean when we're saying that? And might our definitions be unintentionally reinforcing the stereotypes we have of particular groups of people, right? And I think what you demonstrated is like the stories we're trying to tell, the connections we're trying to make this is all of our story, right? We're dealing with things, and how do we talk about it in those ways? How do we think about that? How do we it might not have to be like the specific thing that I went through and now I care about it. It's like, no, we're all, we've all had these various experiences. When we combine that together, that helps us think about how we move things together for children and families or holistically. I don't know, I'm just sort of wrestling with this, lifting up of a particular group. Sometimes I like talk about it, in like the early 2000s, it was like urban education, and it was like, that really meant like poor black kids, right? But we didn't say that, we said this other thing. And so my wondering through this is, as we move forward, as we think about our stories, as we think about how we build coalitions, and how we engage in conversation around all of us, how do we help build messages that encapsulate all of our experiences collectively, as opposed to sort of like, particular ones.
Thank you, Daniel.
I guess what I'm thinking about is the things that we want in the future depend on the choices we make today. And if it feels uncomfortable today, that means that we just haven't built up the muscle enough to feel strong in how we're pushing the change. And so I guess I think about it as like a big gym, right? Where we're like working out. We can't expect for things to just overnight magically appear, the people, the groups, the narratives, everything to have set in overnight. We have to put in the reps. And so I guess that's sort of like the metaphor that I have in my head of like, these are the people, we are the people who are in the gym, putting in the work, doing the reps. And we need more people, but we also can't stop. And I think that having faith in that, this is sort of a leap of faith, right? And that future can exist. And to me, when, again, going back to the original question of like, what does it mean to future-proof? I think it means having a process where we feel nimble and agile and strong when it comes to moving forward the ideas that we believe will shape a better future for ourselves and for the next generation.
No, thank you.
And you brought media into this convening. I think we have folks from USA Today and from the LA Times and Axios. I may be missing some others. So welcome. I'm thinking about Laura's question still about how do we tell the story. And a couple of things come to mind. One, we have to engage with the media in new and different ways than perhaps we have before. It's risky because we lose control of the narrative sometime, and yet we've already lost control. So we're better off, in my view, engaging them, partnering them, and inviting them in, and also asking them to help us come up with solutions. Be a part of the solution in addition to telling stories. Secondly, I would say creating mechanisms to allow the people for whom we are serving, tell their own stories. This is kind of a bad example, but it comes to mind is we wanted to recruit more foster parents in the state of Colorado, and we did this in Wisconsin. I don't know if you still do, Jeff. We had the First Lady of the state open up the governor's mansion. We went out and selected foster parents that were diverse from all corners of the state. We invited them and their families into the governor's mansion, held a great ceremony for them. It was really, really wonderful. We did this every year. But then we brought the media in. And we could use their examples, their stories, their successes to tell the story about foster care in our state and to use that as a recruitment strategy to get more foster parents into the system. It's an example of letting the people we're serving tell their own story.
Thank you, Reggie.
That brings in a couple of the things I wanted to say as well, is remembering that, talking with the public, talking to the public through the media is going to be one of the most important strategies you can have to build demand and sustain capacity over time. And as you're doing that, remembering that you've got the work, and the other side of that is the meaning-making work. Your different way of doing human services is creating new meaning networks for people, right? They've got different ways to think about what government is, what programs do, and who we all are, and what we're doing together as a society. But as you're doing that meaning-making work inside, bring some of that outside so that you all can really be an example, right, for other sectors of government and for society, understanding that what you're doing in government really can and is working.
Thank you. We are wrapping up. We went a little bit over, but I think we took the time to have a super important conversation about where we are now, how we got here, not by happenstance. We now also have a new visual and framework of even more incentive to go do our reps at the gym. But as we're thinking about our leadership and the work we're doing, making meaning of it every moment, being really intentional about the discretionary spaces, power, and questions, and even assumptions that we might be thinking or holding back, that actually they might be much more optional than we think. But to really take the collective power and not do it alone, but really with others to build that future for children and families and for our country and for kind of like bringing that humanity back. And so please join me in giving a huge appreciation, applause, thank you to Daniel, Layla, Reggie, and Julie.